Hi, this is Paul. There has been so much good stuff out in the last couple of weeks about Jordan Peterson and God and piecing this all together. I barely have enough time to listen to it, but I want to cover some stuff that we worked through at our meetup last night that was very helpful to me. And let's get moving. I want to just I feel like now I've arrived at a position that I can piece a lot of this stuff together in ways that I wasn't able to before. And it's partly a result of Peterson talking to Roger Scruton, a recent video that Jonathan Pageau did with David Fuller at Rebel Wisdom, and constantly thinking about the resurrection. I'm not going to use a lot of N.T. Wright in this video, but that's the cover of his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. And now I can't advance. Okay, here we go. Classical creedal Christian God looks like this. He's before all things. And if we think about space-time in terms of relativity, it's not terribly hard to think of something before time if you can think of something before space. Now this is or before matter. Now this is obviously at the heart of the materialist conversation, because materialism asserts that material is foundational and everything else is derivative from material. I think in the 20th century and now into the 21st century, we've seen the increasing demolition of that position as a viable option philosophically and scientifically. And there's always a lag in terms of popular conceptions of this, but that to me seems to be the case. The classical creedal Christian God is before all things. He's the creator of all things. He creates stuff, and so therefore he creates time, and therefore eternal, which is of the age. Eternal has no beginning and no end. And so if you think about a creator God, it's not hard to think about that God outside of time. He sustains all things. All which he creates is subject to him because he made it, in the same way that a machine is subject to the maker of the machine. The maker of a machine puts the machine together. I don't want to get too hung up on the machine metaphor. That's a much older metaphor for the universe. But he sustains all things. And now my definition of that which is most real is that which governs, or that which colonizes, or that which selects, or that which controls, or that which determines. You can look at Jordan Peterson's conversation with Sam Harris, and Jordan Peterson's what I call God number one in Jordan Peterson's schema. You can look back on my videos. Classical creedal Christian God endures beyond what I call the age of decay in this world, and this is how the Greeks sought to. In this world, everything decays. Every example of love will die with death or betrayal, but love itself endures. Death governs the world today. That's basically the idea of the age of decay. Death governs it. I will die. My physical body is breaking down all the time. I decay. And people, well, okay, but maybe, how long do lobsters live? Lobsters live a long time. We don't really know the theoretical lifetime of a lobster. At least I don't know it. Heat death, however, of the universe, at least one person at the meetup wanted to cast doubts on that. But most materialists today will concede the heat death of the universe. Often, if you watch a documentary, you'll get the bad news that someday the sun will run out of fuel, and you'll get the good news, you'll die before the sun runs out of fuel. And so what we see is that this universe is governed by death. All right? Now, in the creedal Christian story, Jesus' resurrection conquers death. And most of the time, especially within contemporary the evangelical frame, this is what's focused on is my personal death. That's a function of individualism in our context. That's the function of just the natural self-preoccupation. When I die, what happens to me when I die? Well, Jesus' resurrection conquers death. Romans 6, if you're baptized into you're baptized into Christ, you're baptized into his death, you're baptized into his resurrection. That's Romans 6. And this is just kind of a quick outline of classic creedal Christian God, and just a vague brief outline of the story. I don't know why my button isn't working. There we go. Now, Jonathan Pageau, this is part of the reason I always use JBP for Jordan B. Peterson as separate from JP for Jonathan Pageau is because I'm always dealing with both of them, and they have the same initial for their first and last names, which is why I always include the B for Jordan B. Peterson. Well, Jonathan Pageau had a fascinating interview with David Fuller at Rebel Wisdom, and I thought that this interview brought together a whole number of things. And at my meetup last night, actually, we split up into two groups, and one of the groups focused on Jonathan Pageau, because Jonathan has been a really helpful conversation partner in this. One of Kyle from San Luis Obispo, who's been, as many of the people that I talk with in this, I used to be a hardcore materialist, started listening to Jordan Peterson, started listening to Jonathan Pageau, and Pageau with his ideas of symbol and the priority, which is first, the priority of material or the priority of symbol. Now, I didn't include some elements from, there's a class, Buddhism and Cognitive Science, Strawn Cummings had recommended this to me, same guy that Jonathan Pageau talked to, Verkuyke over at University of Toronto. He has an online class of that. Not a lot of viewers, but he does a nice job of talking about Aristotle, how Aristotle brings this in of how you have the four causes. One of the causes basically gives shape to material. I'm not explaining that very well, but watch the video. I'll put a note to it in the comment section. But here Jonathan Pageau goes into his assertion of patterns and theism and what Jordan Peterson said in the Dave Rubin, Ben Shapiro video. So let's listen to a little bit of this video. If it will come up.
What that means to some degree is that there's a spirit of masculinity that's shaping the entire structure of human evolutionary history. That's what that means. And then I think, okay, well, that might just be a biological epiphenomenon. And so it would be a spirit it's the spirit of positive masculinity that manifests itself across epochal ages, millions of years perhaps. And it actually has shaped our consciousness, actually. And so you can think about that as a figure, and it would be the figure that emerges. It's like the essential spirit of all the great men who defined what greatness constituted. That's a spirit. Okay, now that's a purely biological explanation. You could say, well, that's God for all intents and purposes. You might have an image of that built right into you. Even the sense that you can experience something divine and paternal might be merely a reflection of that evolutionary process. So that would be a biologically reductive argument for the existence of what we experience as God. But then there's another possibility too, which is that that's actually reflective of a deeper metaphysical reality that has to do with the nature of consciousness itself. And I would say that I think that's true. I believe the biological case, and I believe the biologically reductive case, but I don't think that exhausts it. I think that there's a metaphysical layer underneath that the biology is a genuine reflection of. And that's the sort of the macrocosm above and the microcosm below. That we are really reflective, including in our consciousness, of something about the structure of reality itself. And that might involve whatever it is that God is.
Now, one of the things that Kyle from San Luis Obispo, I'd known this story, his assertion that basically how Pageau and Peterson found each other and why they interested each other is that both had this assumption that reality is fundamentally patterns. And I'd heard this from both of them before, and I was just trying to get my head around it. What do you mean reality is fundamentally patterns? I had enough materialism still in me that no, that can't be right, because the matter is foundational and the patterns are derivative. And what Kyle from San Luis Obispo observed about Pageau was that Pageau simply flips that around and says, okay, well, what if the pattern is foundational and the matter expresses the pattern? In other words, the pattern governs and the matter yields and is governed and shaped by the pattern. Okay, and so you flip that around and you start thinking about it that way. And then you start thinking about Aristotle and Aristotle's causes, how, you have the wood and then you have the form of the chair, and together it becomes the chair. Okay, so what is a chair? And Peterson goes into this. Is a stump a seat? Well, how does a stump become a seat? And so right away you have this question, okay, what is first, the materiality or the pattern? And it seems very clear that that which is most real is that which governs. And pattern governs matter. Pattern organizes matter. Pattern brings order into matter. And so again, what Peterson and Pageau have been saying is that, well, reality is patterns. And again, I heard that. What do you mean by that? What kind of patterns? And learned a little bit of Aristotle and started to piece this together and say, yeah, obviously, patterns govern matter. Patterns colonize matter. Okay, well, how does this connect up with creedal Christianity? Well, we're going to get there. So now Pageau.
I think that in the discussion that's been going along with Jordan and the New Atheists and Jordan, based on discussions that I have privately with him, I felt like this is something that he had never really said in public, which he had enunciated in private, things that he was trying to deal with, which is that he's been able to build this bottom-up case for, let's say, the structures of religion, or the idea of deities, or the notion of the Heavenly Father, let's say. He's been able to build it up and explain quite well how, certain biological processes will lead to this formulation, or to these images. But what he hasn't done so much, and what he was doing there is to say, the reason why those patterns brought about these images in the first place is because they necessarily have to be a representation of reality itself, or the reality to the extent that we can engage with it.
Okay, now again, well, what's the definition of reality? Now, rationality rules might jump in. Well, what he jumps in with is, well, reality is the matter. Well, that's your presupposition. That's your starting place. And what's the reason? What's the justification for your starting place? What if, in fact, your starting place is the pattern? Well, you'd say, well, why? Well, don't patterns just emerge from the matter? Well, our observations of the patterns might emerge from the matter, but that's a function of the limitation of what we have. We can only see the matter. The patterns we have to discern rationally. We have to discern mentally, but we only see the matter. So, of course, in our interaction with the world, it's very understandable that people would say, well, the patterns are derivative from the matter. But that doesn't answer the question of why, in the first place, before us, those patterns exist and how those patterns exist. Now, someone might say, well, they follow the rules of nature. But again, the rules of nature are not physical. The rules of nature are not made of atoms. They are, in fact, patterns. So even when Matt Dillahunty says, well, the rules of physics, well, the rules of physics are not physical. They are patterns. And they are, in fact, laws. They are laws that govern matter. And they're not physical. Well, then you say, well, where do they come from? Well, why do they have the shape that they're having? Well, they're coming from someplace, and they're governing matter. And in fact, the rules that we, through science, the logos of observation, that we start to write down and hypothesize and test and discern and put into books and all of this, these are patterns that we recognize from the material world, from the physical world, but they don't explain why the physical world has that pattern. Our explanation comes via the physical world because that's what we're observing, but our explanation simply talks about the pattern and the repetition of the pattern and the thoroughgoing, consistent repetition of the pattern. It doesn't actually answer the question why the pattern is as it is. And so what Pageau is basically doing is flipping it around and saying, well, why don't you assume the pattern first? And then assume that materiality is following the pattern. Okay, well, what or who founds the pattern? Well, what does instilling a pattern on, well, what is the pattern instilled on? Well, just rationally, pattern is still instilled upon undifferentiated stuff. Well, what is undifferentiated stuff? Well, actually, you can find it in Genesis 1. That's tohu avohu. That's this great sea. It's earth and sea. It's light and darkness. It's all these elements all mixed together in Genesis 1. And then the spirit, the ruach, comes upon. Now you take, as Jordan Peterson does, you take John 1 and you bring it right there into Genesis 1. And, well, it's the Spirit of God taking the stuff and putting it into the pattern and inhabitable. And in Genesis 1, again, read John Walton, The Lost World of Genesis 1. Creation is bringing this order, is bringing habitable order. Let there be light. It's in Genesis 1. Now, I'm not saying God doesn't create light, because God is the origin of all things. That's why I started with classical theism. But God calls the light day and the darkness night. And that made John Walton pause and say, well, that's why doesn't he call the light light and the darkness dark? He calls the light day and the darkness night. Why? He's organizing it. He's governing it. He's putting the pattern onto the matter. And so right there in Genesis 1, in a sense, you have this assertion that pattern is foundational and matter receives or submits to pattern. Matter submits to spirit. Let's let Jonathan keep going.
And so the notion is that the reason why this images pops up and comes up bottom up is because it is participating in the structure of reality itself. And so the image of deities or of God or of the transcendent, they are capturing something about the manner in which reality works itself. So that's why when we engage.
Now, when he says that, when he says how reality works itself, he's saying, just like Jordan Peterson, there's a spirit. What do we mean by spirit? Well, that's going to get, it's not really so complicated, but what it does is we have these ideas of what spirit is in our head via our experience, via our stories and all of this, which is in some ways a reduction to what Peterson means by spirit. It's the ruach over the waters. It's the breath over the waters. Now, what is breath? Well, in Hebrew, all of this symbolism comes together. Ruach, spirit, is also breath, is also wind. Well, what is that? Well, that's change. That's governing. That's taking the matter and putting it together. What we've done with making this little headphone case is we've taken petroleum of various ways and we've applied logos to petroleum and we have governed it and we have colonized it into a nice little useful little gadget. Now we have a zipper here and you've got a little bit of metal here in this zipper and you've got some things from the petroleum. This is spirit governing petroleum. This is spirit governing stuff. This is a pattern and it's a circle that's nice and pleasing. It's a nice size for me to hold in my hand and it's part of this whole. Now we've got some rubber here and we've got some metal here in the wire and we've got a microphone. This is all spirit governing stuff. Well, why the patterns? Well, where do the patterns come from? Does the pattern come from petroleum? No, there's potential in the petroleum that we logos apply to it and create this. And the Genesis story is God doing this and creating habitable order out of the world. Now you might say, well, matter is derivative, but here's the question. Why does it take the shape that it does? Why are we so fortunate to have matter just kind of happen to produce this amazing world with water and hillocks and day and night? And now obviously we see the already made patterns, including us, expressed in matter. And so we take, as sub-creators, we discern the patterns from what we see and we write them down. That's what we do with science, but it doesn't explain why it has the shape that it has. And what Pageau is saying, well, that there's something underneath expressing itself in these patterns. Well, the patterns are expressing themselves. Well, what are the patterns? Well, that's what we're always talking about. We're always talking about the patterns. We pay especially close attention to the patterns, partly because of time, because we're terribly invested in enduring through time. And we're going to talk about this endurance in a couple of minutes. But that which governs, that which is God, is that which endures through time, and that which outlasts its rivals. And this is there's something Darwin sees this in what he does.
Engage in those patterns and those structures. That's why they then become a way to make, let's say, it's for humanity to thrive, or for the human species to continue.
Now, thrive here also has a function of our will, but now will is a very complicated thing. Where does will come from? Well, Peterson, again, we'll talk about motivation, and in a sense, motivation is personality, and all of this, but this thriving is part of it. And so we're leaning into the future, and we're discerning these patterns, and we're employing these patterns, and we're colonizing the stuff of this world. We colonized petroleum in order to make this handy little headphone case. All right. And we've done that with plants. We've done that with animals. We've done that with the entire earth. In fact, we've colonized the stuff of earth. And that's, again, why I would say that spirit, C.S. Lewis gets into this in his book, Miracles, spirit governs stuff. Patterns govern stuff. That's fundamental to our living. It's fundamental to who we are. This is how we are sub-creators. This is what we're doing.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, the question that comes up, I guess, is that may be true. And I think in that he also says that the danger here is that you're explaining religion versus explaining religion away. And I think Jordan in that clip says something about you can explain it this way. It is a pattern of being. That doesn't exhaust the possibility that there's a metaphysical structure or there's a metaphysical aspect to it as well. And I guess...
But the idea is that why is there this pattern of being? That's what we got kind of come back to, is that why does reality lay itself out this way? Why does, and he hits the nail right at the right place, which is he talks about how it's basically the structure of consciousness. So this hierarchy, this hierarchy that he sets up is the structure of consciousness. And so that's why there are analogies, let's say, between the hierarchy he sets up in terms of this idea of the spirit of the Father, which kind of rises up and manifests itself as this transcendent Father. And also it's analogous to the idea of space, which is, you create a center of space and then you lay out a space around it, the notion of a center of time around which a cycle will then proceed. And so all these the center of a community in terms of a chief, or in terms of an ideal that everybody gathers around and creates unity.
As we're getting into the principalities and powers, which we're going to talk in a little bit later, about how there's the spirit of Apple that is manifest in Apple, and you had Steve Jobs and Johnny Ives coming together, and they created Apple. Now they created this spirit of Apple that dominated, and I don't have any Apple products around me. Well, maybe I'll go grab one. Hang on. I do have an Apple product around me. I have a power supply for a 2012 MacBook Pro that I renovated because my mother found. I put in an SSD and I added RAM. Steve Jobs and Johnny, well, this is the power supply for Apple. And let's see if I can get you have the spirit of Apple, you have the logo. That compared to this kind of anonymous brick for the Dell computer that I'm recording this on. But here the spirit of Apple is manifest in this power supply, and you have this clever little, you can take this off and plug the wart right into the wall with a little adapter, or if you need more cord. I mean, just look at how pleasing all of this is. Okay, this is art, this is science, this is the colonization of technology and materials and rubber and plastic and petroleum and metal, and it's put into design. Now obviously we say, well, and then you have these nice little ears where you can wrap this cord around if you want to, and you can make it, it's just pleasing. So you have all of these patterns, and this all comes together. And this is the spirit of Apple from Steve Jobs and Johnny Ives, and they put it together. Now, Steve Jobs is dead, and so part of the reason I was excited to renovate that 2012 MacBook Pro was because there's been a lot of criticism about the new Macs, and many people believe that the spirit of Apple, I don't want to send this video down an Apple conversation, but the spirit of Apple is decaying with the loss of Steve Jobs and what he brought to it, how he created the spirit of Apple, how matter was subjugated to the patterns. And these patterns came from Steve Jobs, but Steve Jobs, again, also is derivative of this long line of humanity. And Steve Jobs employed this long line of technology, and it all came together. And so you had a principality and power, you had the spirit of Apple.
Around this thing that is above them, and so this idea is that the reason why this is because it's the shape of consciousness, and consciousness becomes the analogy to the structure of the cosmos itself, or the way in which we interact with what causes the universe to exist. The idea is that the pattern is not arbitrary. It could not have been in another way. That's the pattern of reality.
But
now you should definitely listen to the whole video. The whole video is outstanding, and I haven't want to go beyond that. So at the meetup we had, we talked about materialism at our meetup. And so again, what endures or what governs over life? Now Darwin, in a sense, says that, well, that which governs are our materiality, our DNA that gets promoted, and this one species dominates another, and on and on and on it goes in terms of life. Now this is limited to things that we know, of course. And what I also wanted to pull the focus back a little bit is notice that this competition between life and death in the world that we know. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, life is always in a competition with death. Well, how does life, on one hand, you might say, well, death always wins. Death always wins over every individual life. And if you assume the heat death of the universe, death wins over the entire story in a materialist frame. But what's interesting about life is that life does, in fact, colonize death. Birds will take twigs and construct nests. We take petroleum and rubber and other products, and we construct cases like this. And we make, in fact, MacBook Pro power supplies. So life is in that way. We got light issues with this. I wondered if I could have enough light to deal with what's behind me. It's getting brighter out there. Life colonizes the material world, and I think that's part of the reason we see that motivates us to live in the ways that we live. And that's how we see living things colonizing and governing matter. Worms and moles burrow. We move stuff. Animals and human beings reshape the world. Read 1493, the story of the Homo Genesine, how humanity and the animals that we moved and the plants that we moved have terraformed the world, and the living things continue to govern on planet Earth. This oxygen that we have, this CO2 to oxygen, living things are governing. You say, well, all of those things come from matter. Yeah, but where do the patterns come? Where does the matter bring in the patterns? And again, read Aristotle for that, and I'll put the link to that other thing. So what endures? Well, life endures. Well, does life endure beyond death? Well, this is the race. This is the competition that we're facing. And it's interesting how we prioritize the living over the organic, because we think the moon is interesting, but nowhere near as interesting as Earth. Because we, the living, colonize the inorganic to a degree, but not death. Again, we're always in this competition with death. Life has limited dominion over the Earth. It's always in a war with death. This is a perpetual state of war, and it's a struggle with death. Now, reality is patterns. Reality is that which governs. That which governs is what's most real. And, well, you can see this in terms of what is death. I've been thinking a lot about death again because of my sister's death. Well, okay, so someone operations stop in their body, what happens? Well, the body starts to break down, and again, other forms of life begin to colonize and begin to eat the body, but the body becomes inorganic, all right, and becomes just the stuff, the material beneath it. And so you always have this life and death struggle. But reality, that which is most real, is that which is governing. My living body can hold this, my dead body can't. My living body can move a shovel and move earth, my dead body can't. My living body, together with this whole civilization and logos-based community, can make things like this with design and with technology and with art, and can bring it all together and govern the world. And one of the things that's going on is, should we have these individual power supplies, or everything should be USB-C? Because part of the problem is this has governed for a while, a few short years, and you got this ugly wart from Dell. Well, all this stuff is going into a landfill, and there's issues with all of this. Okay, so but again, we're governing, and we're in a sense where death works within us. All of this stuff is in Christian language. Death works within us. I asked a smart materialist at our meeting, I won't name him, he doesn't even like to wear a name tag, how do the living beat death? And he said, by propagating my DNA. Now, pay close attention to the my's and we's, and I always tell you that in the videos. Why? I as an individual, beat death because I propagate myself, duplicating a pattern that I am. Even in this definition of what am I, in this definition of how I beat death, I don't mean me fundamentally as a material being. I think of me fundamentally as a pattern or a story. Because what is a story? A story is fundamentally a pattern. Okay? I think of me as a pattern because the atoms and molecules of my body continue to, I trade in and trade out of them as I live until I break down. It's like the ship that you replace all the boards. Well, this is the same ship. Right? The problem of identity. I am a pattern. And so when I say, well, I transcend death, I beat death in a Darwinian way by propagating my DNA, is it the stuff that's being propagated? Or is it the pattern governing and colonizing the stuff? I as an individual, I really mean I, beat death, propagate myself, duplicate the pattern that I am beyond my individual life, and I do so in my children. And so often when we talk in this frame of reference, we think we make all these subtle shifts of identity and pattern that we don't fess up when we tell the story. Because let's say I could find, let's assume Darwinian evolution, let's assume some pattern of species development. Let's imagine I could colonize a biped ancestor, and you can't, but would that biped ancestor say, we continue on through Homo sapiens? Or would a Neanderthal say, our strategy for colonizing the world is to be subjugated by these African ancestors who are going to mate with some of us, kill many of us, and replace us in Northern Europe? Well, what is we? Are we Neanderthals? Are we Homo sapiens? Well, what is a Neanderthal? But an incredibly complex set of patterns. What is a Homo sapien? But an incredibly complex set of patterns. What is DNA? Well, so I looked it up, okay, because I'm not a biochemist. Deoxyribonucleic acid, a self-replicating, boy, that's an interesting word in that sentence. And look at James Tour, I believe. Go ahead and Google him. Check him out in YouTube. He's one of the best biochemists in the world, talking about we can't make this stuff. We don't even know how this stuff works. We have no idea. Well, what is this stuff? Is it actually the chemicals? And we say, well, this just kind of came about. Well, how did it come about? Or why does it have the pattern? Why does it have this incredible pattern that is self-replicating. Well, what is replicating? Are the molecules replicating? The molecules aren't replicating. The molecules are just all there. What's replicating? It's the pattern that's replicating. Even the DNA in me that gets replicated, all that gets replicated is the pattern. It's the information. I think it's a terrible word for it, but it's the pattern that gets replicated. What is propagated isn't really the material layer. You're not making more of the molecules and atoms that make up this acid. What you are doing is replicating the pattern of this acid. And, well, isn't that what we're doing with children? We're replicating our patterns. And DNA is not really the stuff of DNA. It's the pattern of the arrangement of all of this stuff that is getting replicated. So in other words, the pattern is more real than the atoms and molecules that the pattern is colonizing and employing and governing. That's what we're talking about when we talk about Darwinian evolution and this fight between life and death. The stuff that makes up me goes into the ground and becomes inorganic. That's what death is. The pattern stops. It is the pattern of that matter that gets duplicated, sort of, in my kid, because it's not just me, of course, it's my wife, and it's in fact not just us, it's all of these ancestors that we have. It's this incredibly long line, but it's the patterns that get duplicated, not the stuff. Pattern is more real than material. Now, I have a question that I asked last night at the meetup. Who is the most successful propagator of himself in all of human history? Genghis Khan? 1 in 200 men are direct descendants of him, and you can look that up. You can easily find it on the internet. Or Jesus Christ, who produced, to the best of our knowledge, no biological offspring. Well, that's it. Well, Genghis Khan, because he has all these descendants. I would argue it's Jesus Christ. Well, why? Because ideas, logos, patterns, that which governs, is more powerful propagation than sperm. Because Jesus Christ, in fact, has colonized probably a good many of Genghis Khan's descendants without having to conquer nations or burn cities or rape women or have a huge harem. That's how Genghis Khan did it. How does Jesus do it? Well, Jesus is the Logos. Jesus is the Word. Does Jesus overcome the grave better than impregnating women? Well, why is this story of resurrection so central to Christianity? Again, to quote Mr. Plinkett, this little conscious part that's yakking at you, there's a bigger part of me which knows more than this little conscious part that's yakking at you. And sometimes this part of me, again, read Ian McGilchrist, this other part of me, I can't bring it into this part, but it knows, and I get whispers, intimations. Well, what is that often experienced like? Well, the ancients and Pentecostals today, even in materialist America, would call it spirit. Well, the Spirit of God. Well, what is that? So read Yuval Harari's Sapiens. Fun little book. I so enjoyed reading that little book. But one of the points he makes is that stories colonize. Story is more powerful than genetics. Why? Well, genetics are a pattern. Well, story is a pattern. But story morphs and evolves and mutates and governs more than genetics. And again, there's a race. So you've got a race between life and death. You've got a race between genetics and story. And I would argue Jesus Christ being the most successful propagator, a more successful propagator than Genghis Khan, is an example of how story beats genetics. Conversion, Christian conversion, or conversion of any kind, changing your mind is a pattern of story conquering genetics. Because once I adopt a story, well, in fact, this Apple power supply has story built into it. Why do we find it pleasing? Why, on one hand, you can put the ears down so that the shape is there's pattern to it, and there's art to it. But we also have a need for practicality, so we develop these little ears, and aren't they cute? We can wrap the wire around it. So this is all story coming together. Now I got one story tied up in the other. Civilizations are stories. They're big stories. They're big patterns. They have logos. They have principalities and powers which govern them. The spirit of America, the spirit of the British Empire, the spirit of Genghis Khan. It's the language we use, the language we use for principalities and powers. And they govern, they propagate themselves. And we all know that culture propagates. If you live in, I grew up in the United States, and I've always been in the midst of various different cultures. There was the Dutch Calvinist immigrant subculture. There was the African American diaspora subculture in Paterson. There was kind of the white American culture. And then I go to the Dominican Republic, and I'm dealing with Dominican culture and Haitian culture. And then I go to California, and I'm dealing with California culture, which has some more Eastern Asian influences and the spirit of California. So you have all these principalities and powers, and all of these things are patterns. And all of these patterns are governing matter. And I would assert that Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive's design for this power supply with this cute little Apple logo, there's American culture in this. There's California culture in this. There's culture of our time in this. But all of this culture, all of this story, all of these patterns are governing matter. Now, what Harari says is that stories govern DNA better than DNA. It adapts more quickly. It's more powerful. It changes things more rapidly, more dramatically. And this is one of the things that sets human beings apart from the animal kingdom, is that we govern with story. And, well, you want to know how powerful that is? Look around at how quickly civilization has terraformed this world and is governing it. And as our power increases, we govern with ever more and more power and consequence, with opportunity and liability, which is obviously potential. Now, in the Three Creators conversation, they wanted to talk about Jordan Peterson and Logos, and Rachel Brown thought that Peterson had a sub-Christian Logos, and she got into Feuerbach, and I appreciate some of her concerns, but the more I listen to Peterson, and I think the clearer Peterson himself is the pattern that is Peterson continues to evolve on this, and I think he's, in fact, as Pageau recognizes, as he develops this, he is getting more Christian. Now I know in terms of the tribal conversations, there's, will Peterson become Orthodox? Will Peterson become evangelical? And of course, it's a really tribal pattern. Evangelicals, part of what makes them strong is they propagate and they colonize and they evangelize. And the main line doesn't, which is part of why they're dying. But that colonization is part of historic Christianity. So the Orthodox do, but they do it in their Orthodox way. And the Roman Catholics do, so they do it in their Catholic way. And the Dutch Reformed do, so we do it in our Dutch Reformed way. And the Evangelicals do, and so they do it in their evangelical way. But Rachel is afraid that Jordan Peterson is too sub-Christian in his Logos. Well, let's look at the Logos a little bit. So the Logos governs materiality. That's what we've been talking about. And death is a brutal competitor. The sword is used to silence Jesus as it's used to silence many. Tell me the truth or shut up. And so you put a gun to someone's head. The sword, I'm using metaphorically, can be a physical sword, but it's a metaphor for the threat of death against a pattern-bearing, logos-bearing agent in this world. It's used to silence. And one of the things I often say about the story of Jesus is that you had this really bloody culture war that was going on in Judea and the Galilee in the first century, and you had bitter, brutal enemies against each other. You had Jewish nationalists versus Roman imperialists versus Herodian accommodationalists, and people were killing each other over this. And Jesus comes in, and these sides that were terribly determined to either subjugate or destroy or get out of subjugation the other. They couldn't agree on much, but the only thing they could agree on was that they wanted Jesus silenced. They wanted Jesus dead. They didn't like the logos. They didn't like the words. And the way to get rid of Jesus, the way to silence him, was get rid of his words. And this is part of the reason why free speech in our current conversation is such a hot topic, because word governs. Word is pattern, and it literally patterns in airwaves. It's governing the air, and it's colonizing and governing human beings. Again, a Peterson Jungian aphorism, do people have ideas, or do ideas have people? Logos, patterns, words govern stories, civilization. The cross, the manner by which Jesus was killed, actually employed word. It was a powerful Roman political expression. Instead of just disappearing Jesus or taking him out back and killing him or beating him to death, you put him on a cross, which basically employs word by saying, we are the masters of this world. Our pattern, our Roman way of life must dominate you because it's the best pattern. Watch Monty Python, Life of Brian. What have the Romans ever done for us? This is the struggle this is the logos struggle between words and patterns, and this is always at play among us. Here's the thing. Why is resurrection so central to Christianity? Resurrection beats death. Death is the big weapon of the inorganic against the organic. What does the inorganic, in a sense, employ to silence the organic? That's the sword. To disrupt our pattern so that we cannot propagate. All right? Logos in the resurrection beats death. Logos wins. That's the message of the apostles. The apostles go out. Peter in Acts 2 says, Jesus, who you crucified, God raised from the dead. Now that disrupts and energizes the patterns in such a dramatic way that within a few hundred years, it begins taking over the Roman Empire. It colonizes people, and that colonization has been happening ever since. It's happening in China now. It's happening in Africa now. It's in the West. The war, the culture war, the war, that we're fighting is this long-term war. Now, these wars are long term. The wars of genetics go millions of years. The wars of ideas go hundreds and thousands of years because they work that much more quickly. Okay? That's Yuval Harari's point. Also, the individual, Jesus is alive and still speaking metaphorically and literally. When he appears to the Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus, he speaks and he colonizes Paul. In fact, the whole story of the New Testament is speaking, colonizing matter, colonizing stories, colonizing people, colonizing swords, colonizing buildings, colonizing story, colonizing. This is the way in which Jesus reigns and Jesus colonizes better and faster than Genghis Khan, who was using the older method of genetics. This is why word is so powerful. Now, Oscar Wilde puts this beautiful, and I get this from N.T. Wright and Jesus, the Son of the Resurrection and the Son of God. Oscar Wilde in his play Salome. Herod, he raises the dead. First Nazarene. Yes, sire, he raises the dead. He raiseth the dead. Herod, I do not wish him to do it. Why does Herod not wish Jesus to raise the dead? Because Herod's power is based on the sword. And once resurrection comes, the sword is defeated. And this is, in fact, symbolically, say again, the resurrection has this, the resurrection as pattern, as idea, as story, has this all built into it in an incredibly compact way. And this is part of the reason why I don't think Jordan Peterson has gotten to this point with understanding the resurrection yet, because the resurrection not only can be understood metaphorically, why we appropriate Easter eggs and Easter bunnies and all of these things as new life, as the phoenix rising from the ashes. The resurrection also is the triumph of story over matter. It's the final culmination of death, which is the inorganic versus the organic. It is also, in fact, the culmination of story, the win of story power over genetic power, because that's always a race too. But Herod doesn't want that, because the resurrection unseats every petty dictator that uses threats of violence, that's the inorganic, against the living. That's what the sword does. I do not wish him to do that, because that's the principality and power of Herod's power. I forbid him to do that. Now he's trying to use word to colonize Jesus. Well, is Jesus not going to do it? No. Just like, and that's why Jesus goes to death, so he can beat death. I allow no man to raise the dead. If Herod had that power, he would allow it, because he would employ it, but he would employ it according to his logos, according to his spirit, according to his pattern, according to his principality and power. This man must be found and told that I forbid him to raise the dead. Where is this man found? Notice the capital M in man. Second Nazarene. He is in every place, my Lord, but it is hard to find him. What do you mean hard to find him? What does he mean by that? It's hard to lay hands on him. Why? Well, because the Logos has now perfectly colonized the material. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, Jesus said. I will be with you always to the end of the age, Jesus says. All of this lines up with all of these patterns. And it all comes together in this story. Now, part of the reason that the three creators and Rachel Fulton Brown was complaining about the Logos is because Peterson is operating with this Logos on a variety of levels. The Logos in us, and you get into the Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson conversations. Jordan Peterson is so insistent on the a priori structure, and Peterson goes into great depth about this in his book Maps of Meaning, and talks about how in fact Logos, story, rearranges this world and in fact creates the world. When you clean your room, you create a world, and this is what we are doing all throughout what we do in civilization, and that's right. Now, what I think is behind some of the but is you have this older undermining of materialism that's inherent in older forms of Christianity, but some materialism sneaks into that. And I think the older form of Christianity already had subsumed within it a representation of how materiality and patterns work together. And the fear of listening to Peterson is that Peterson is going to go off in a Gnostic direction. And after continuing to listen to Maps of Meaning, it's such a hard book to work through. It's such a long book to work through. I think I'm less and less concerned with that about Peterson, because I think he is in fact working through these issues, and his answers are coming together in a very Christian way. At least that's what I see. Logos confronting the chaos of tohu vavohu creates the world. And now this happens at variety of levels and layers. It happens in small ways. It happens when we clean our room. And that's a pattern of reality, of these patterns. Think of them kind of like fractals. They in fact scale. So it's true of your room, and it's true of your life, and it's true of civilization, and it's true of existence itself. And that's why the resurrection is so foundational to this whole thing. Because in the resurrection, Logos conquers death. In the resurrection, Logos conquers the inorganic. In the resurrection, Logos conquers genetics. Logos, in fact, is at the top of the hierarchy and colonizes all of these things, and that's why it's most real. And that's why, for example, at the beginning of Colossians, in Colossians 1, Jesus is the icon of the invisible God. Jesus is the author, he's the logos of creation 1.0, but he's also now the first fruits of creation 2.0, where finally the hierarchy will be set to right, and all of the relationships will be in line, and everything will flow. That's the eschaton. That's the life of the age to come. That's when you read eternal life in English, if you're reading, say, the Gospel of John, that's life of the age. That is life the way it's supposed to be when thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's what this entire story is moving towards. And again, if you want to read N.T. Wright's The Old Testament and the People of God, this first of his magnum opus, his four-stage magnum opus, N.T. Wright goes into what is a story in some of these things, and actually in terms of books like Maps of Meaning, N.T. Wright's first book there is most like it. Boy, I hope the sun doesn't get much brighter there and just really blows out this camera. All right, we see it colonizing and governing the inorganic. Now, like I said, we've just been blessed with a wealth of stuff lately. And this conversation with Roger Scruton was off the charts, amazing. And what he said here in this piece, now they're talking about the transcendent. Now, what is the transcendent? Well, pay attention how often people who are avoiding talking about Christianity use the word transcendent in, so I have to, all right. Now my dog's streaming, so I hear him whooping over there. All right, let's eliminate some of the blowout from the backlight. Pay attention how often people use the word transcendent to avoid using the word God. In a sense, this is so common in what happened in the story of the West, that pluralism gave us. My wife is always worried about how much I reveal about the family in the background material. I should probably get a sheet or something. Pay attention to how much, those little Dutch spoons, how often people, well, we don't want to say God because, well, now suddenly we're being too Christian. All right, well, there's a bad and a good part to that impulse. So we're going to use transcendent. Well, what is transcendent? It's the thing that not only overarches everything, but also ties it together. That which brings order out of the chaos of multiplicity and pluralism. So, okay, they're going to use the transcendent. And he asked Roger Scruton what he thought the transcendent is. And now he's going to ask Peterson. And the answer Peterson gives here is, I think what he's achieved here in this answer is this. He's taken Maps of Meaning and his conversation with Sam Harris, and he's distilled it right down into the most compact, nicely compact form with a handle that I've ever heard him say. And when he said this, I was blown away. And I listened to it again and again and again. Just amazing. Here he goes.
Well, as an adjunct to that, so Roger mentioned that the transcendent is what we bump up against when we realize our ignorance. And so it's that which transcends our ignorance. And that in itself makes it an implacable fact.
Now, the ultimate transcendent transcends everything and colonizes everything and governs everything.
Unless you believe that you have no ignorance, in which case there's no point in furthering a discussion with you.
If you believe you have no ignorance, you are immune to logos, and that could also just simply be a definition of hell.
So the transcendent is the fact insofar as it's that which transcends our ignorance, but you can also think about it technically. So, and I think we know enough about how the brain works now, so that, not that we know much, so that useful things can be said about that. You tend to represent the world in the simplest manner that you possibly can that works for what you're doing.
That's because we're limited creatures, and all of Jordan Peterson's stuff about hierarchies is because of our limitation. We have to use hierarchies because we can't take the whole thing in. In Christianity, of course, God can take the whole thing in and know it all at once. We can't. We're limited, so we have to set up hierarchies, and we have to prioritize, and actions prioritize us, and thinking prioritizes us, and conscious prioritizes us. So hierarchies are always a function of consciousness and limitation and action. That's why we need hierarchies, because we can't take the whole thing in at once. We just can't process it.
You don't actually see the world. You see sufficiently useful, low resolution representations of the world. And if they work, then that's fine. There's no need to adjust them, and they're relatively easy to remember and to manipulate. But now and then you have a misapprehension about someone, let's say, and you have a conversation with them, and the conversation goes sideways. And what that means is that the thing that you thought you were conversing with is not the thing that you're conversing with, and that manifests itself in error. Right? So error is the place where the transcendent reveals itself. And what is actually revealing itself is the reality that's outside and underneath your perceptions. And so what you see in the world, in some sense, is a set of animated cartoons. And a lot of that is actually a consequence of you seeing nothing but your memory.
Now again, he's a psychologist, and he's really got this stuff down. And the more I listen to him and learn from him, I think he's right. These are the representations with which we use to interact. This is what Don Hoffman is getting at, that we're always interacting with icons on the screen. We're always interacting with representations. Now that's the only way we can interact with the world against, because we're limited, because our consciousness is limited. Our actions necessitate setting up a hierarchies. I need to break the egg before I can make a fried egg in the pan. These hierarchies and priorities all come in. And so what we're dealing with is, and it's mostly from memory, because we can't take in the whole thing. And so we spend a good bit of our infant just trying to bring this all down and create these maps in our head so that we can begin to interact with this world, so we can begin to colonize it, so we can begin to dominate it, so we can have dominion over it, so we can govern it.
Because your brain is organized so that instead of going through all of the difficulty of having to look at the thing in itself, you look at what you assume to be there. And if you can get away with that, so much the better. But the thing in itself is always much richer than your apprehension of it, which is partly why you make mistakes, but also partly why you can continue to garner wisdom in the world. There's always more there than meets the eye. And God only knows how much more there's there than meets the eye.
God, or we could say only God knows how much more there is meet to eye has not seen, ear has not heard.
And you can show this even in the religious sense to some degree, because you could say that there's an element to the transcendent that instills people with a sense of religious significance. You can do that by immediately, scientifically, by feeding people chemicals, for example, that disrupt the inhibition of perception by memory. And then that puts them in a place where the transcendent tends to reveal itself, sometimes in overwhelming force. So this is...
Now what he means, now, again... Rachel Brown says, and he's used drugs. That's what he's talking about right here. The point of that is not that if you use a psychedelic, you'll see God. The point is that what the psychedelics do, perhaps, is strip off the governors in your mind, and what you see, what you get a glimpse of, what you can appreciate, is that the world is much bigger than what you see is that what life requires of you is to make the world smaller so that you can interact with it. Someone who has taken these drugs is too impaired to drive a vehicle, because in order to drive a vehicle, you need to see a lot, but only certain amounts. And when you drive a vehicle, my family always complains because we love taking trips to national parks. And if I'm driving and I'm in this beautiful national park, I don't want to look at the road. I want to look at the walls of Yosemite Valley. I want to look at the vistas of Rocky Mountain National Park. This is where I want to go. But in order to drive safely for my family, I have to focus on the road. And what happens when you take these psychedelics is that, well, you'd better not be driving, because suddenly your aperture is open. And the point that should be made by this is, well, now you see that the world is a lot bigger than what you thought it was. Okay, what's the takeaway from that? Well, that in fact, these patterns are governing. And in fact, what we do is we limit the world and we make it smaller so that we can work with it. So that's what cleaning your room is about. Again, all of this stuff just scales down.
It's not some fiction that this exists. What's transcendent is more real than the reality that you perceive.
Well, let's pick.
And that's his claim against the new atheist, that this is not a fiction, this is not a fantasy. That dismissal that is used by the new atheists is offensive and ludicrous. Now, David Fuller, in his conversation with Jonathan, wades in and says, which is usually the common thing, yeah, but pluralism. Why Christianity? Because that offends us. Because, well, even if you say, well, even Christianity can't see the whole, and I would argue, well, Christians can't see the whole because we're human beings. So then the trick that's done is, well, we want a broader vision. Okay, well, take a psychedelic and drive on a mountain road. There's your broader vision. What do you need in order to navigate? Do you need the broadest vision possible, or do you need a vision that is appropriately selective and yet sufficiently broad? That's what you do when you drive. You need a vision that is appropriate selective. I've got to keep an eye on the line in the road, where the road is, where my car is, what's happening with other cars, maybe a bear coming into the road. All of this is appropriately selective, but it's also sufficiently broad. I need to see enough of the road. And that balance has to be right. There's your chaos order balance. You've got to get that right. Well, but there are these other religions besides Christianity. Okay, now we've introduced also the subjective into it, because I want some things to be true. For example, look at Thomas Nagel when he talks about Christianity. I don't want there to be a God. Why don't I want there to be a God? I don't want there to be a God because once there is a God, suddenly I am subject. I don't want to be subject. Why don't I want to be subject? Because I want to be God. Because I think I want to be God. I think when you get right down to it, it could be that what this entire story of humanity that we are in the midst of, that the Bible attempts to be the pattern setter of that story, says, we think we want to be God, and the more experience we have with being God, the more we don't like it, because the more we realize we're not good gods. We're destructive. We're tyrannical. We're not good gods. We're in fact lousy gods, but we think we want to be gods because, well, addiction is in a sense the will running amok. Pretty soon, let's say, I want wine. I love wine. I actually don't drink wine, but I don't drink wine because I don't like it, not because Dutch Calvinists do drink alcohol. But I want wine. I like wine. Pretty soon I colonize wine, but if I make wine my whole life, then wine colonizes me. This is the dilemma of human beings. And this is where, again, you need a proper hierarchy. If you have the proper hierarchy, the first things are first. Wine is a good thing, but not an ultimate thing. And as long as wine is my servant and not my master, wine can be a blessing. Once wine becomes my master, I no longer become human. This is C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce. The person who grumbles all the time eventually just becomes a grumble. The grumble has displaced their personhood. It has taken too high a position in the hierarchy, and now it has subsumed what should be sovereign, which is their image-bearing nature as a human being. So David says, well, why Christianity? Well, let's look at that. How do other religions represent patterns? Because again, patterns are foundational. The material gets organized by patterns. Patterns colonize material. Well, surely there are better or worse representations. We all understand that. And we're talking an incredibly complex situation here. Christians generally don't claim that other religions get everything wrong. Christians claim that Christianity gets it more right. Well, you might say, well, that's offensive. Well, no. We all claim that whatever patterns of thought and whatever perspective we have and whatever we imagine the world to be gets it more right. Because if I thought something else got it more right, I would be that. We are always governed by that which we think is most right. That's what it means to be stewarding a worldview. My worldview is that which I think is most right. Okay, so Christians obviously believe that they are most right. People who follow other religions obviously believe that their system is most right. And I don't think that's cause for consternation. I think that's just obvious in terms of how human beings get along. If I sit down with a Jew or a Muslim or a secularist or a Buddhist or a Hindu, they obviously think they're most right. I obviously think I'm more right. Well, I have governance over me, and so I'm going to govern myself as in the way that I think is most right. It's just the way it works. Well, is anything most right? Is one thing not more right than another? Well, we don't believe that, and we don't act as if we believe that. Now, Christians generally don't claim that other religions get everything wrong, but that their vision of the patterns are incomplete or less accurate in some ways. This is when we get into the question of revelation. And again, Christians talk about general and special revelation. What revelation is, that which reveals the truth. And throughout Christian history, there's been doctrines of revelation and how we think about it. But I often so much of the talk about the Bible that I hear in debates, often between, let's say, modernist evangelicals and secularists, don't really represent, I think, what revelation is and how it works. Because let's assume that the Bible is the revelation of God. Once I approach that Bible, I bring my contamination to the Bible, and I can't apprehend it purely and perfectly. You say, well, I have the same thing with the natural world. I bring my biases, I bring my a priori structure, both to the natural world and to the Bible, and my appropriation of it is imperfect because I am imperfect. It's basic Calvinism. Basic Christianity, I'd argue. We have similar challenges, but no similar qualms when it comes to science. In fact, this is no different from how we manage science. We have, throw away the Bible altogether. You have the world, the natural order. That is revelation. Well, how do you deal with that revelation? Once I come to it, in terms of my subjective self, my subjectivity comes onto it. And now it's here where Jordan Peterson gets very interesting, because in a sense, the modernist perspective says my subjectivity contaminates it. Well, but my subjectivity also co-creates it in some ways, because, and hence it's why we get duplication, pluralism, and contamination, because I need that a priori structure. I need those hierarchies, and that's all been built into me long before I was ever born, because we needed those structures in order to apprehend the world at all and interact with the world at all. One lifetime is not sufficiently long to do so. And if you go into my videos about, God 1 and God 2, this is what we're talking about. If as a Christian you look at the Bible as special revelation, you have many of the same difficulties with the Bible, that I apprehend the Bible through a tradition of Calvinism, and I apprehend the Bible now through a tradition of modernistic reading, and then later on I apprehend the Bible through a tradition of learning from literary biblical scholars like Robert Alter and So the science of studying, the scientia of studying the Bible has this whole tradition, and we can't help but do that. And again, these are the patterns governing the stuff, but this is part of the interaction. And so pluralism is always a function, but we ought not to be the pluralistic impulse of, well, the Bible can't be right, is just simply the opposite reflection of the tribal assertion that the Bible is always right. And again, I'm not drawing judgments between those, but the reactions to the same thing. The reactions that say, well, now I do believe that the Bible is the infallible word of God, but that of course comes to me through my tradition and comes to me. John Calvin says it's the Holy Spirit works in my heart. Well, what does he mean by that? Well, there's a whole nother long conversation. But that's what theology is. It's this long conversation. But this pluralist demand is just simply the mirror opposite of the tribal demand. It's post-Christendom nervousness of worldview tyranny. But it's just a demand. And so what you actually have to do is look at it and say, well, let's take a look at these things and see who has the better revelation, whose logos-based representations of the patterns is most true to, in the broadest possible way, all the patterns that we are knowing and seeing and the patterns that are enduring. Now, science is a logos-based representation of a limited subset of reality, the attempt of stripping away consciousness. And again, this is what Pageau is constantly getting at. Notice how science uses numbers and words. We apply, in a sense, logos to try and discern the patterns. My thing had showed it had stopped recording. I didn't know where it had stopped recording. I didn't lose anything. Good. Science is a logos-based representation to a limited subset of reality with consciousness stripped away. Notice how science uses numbers and words. It's a representation. We watch the patterns that we see revealed in materiality. We pull them out into a logos representations and we manipulate them, and then we try to apply them to other things. That is, in a sense, technology. And that's what we're always doing as human beings. We do it in psychology. We do it in theology. We take what we learn over here by this pattern and we try to apply it to this pattern, and we see if it works. And if it works, we think, ooh, we have a very useful pattern. This is what Peterson is talking about when he's talking at the beginning of the conversation with Scruton. Now, DNA as pattern uses hacks and tricks to temporarily outmaneuver death. Now, it's very interesting in the Old Testament, the Hebrew patriarchs focused on descendants. About the worst thing that could happen to you in the Bible was to be cut off. Meant that your children would not endure. How tremendously Darwinian and DNA present, that my pattern will be cut off. And in fact, if you read the Old Testament, you discover, well, teach your children. The whole idea of covenant and religion and scripture and all of this is in fact to continue to allow patterns to transcend through time. And that's why stories and worldviews and religions are so powerful, even more powerful than DNA, although they often work together, in that you can transcend time and you can cheat death through story. All right? And that's what's happening when we're using, well, archetypes and archetypal stories, when you have the Avengers and Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, where we have that sense that we are cheating death, and that's where we have classics and works of art that these things are transcending death. You go to the Getty in North LA and you look at these amazing pieces of art and you begin to recognize, wow, these are beating death. Story, logos is beating death. But the Age of Decay works on those fibers in those paintings, and a sword can slash a painting. And so there again, we have the representation of this fight between the organic and the inorganic. But now we have stories that can be put in our minds and told, that can be sometimes represented in books, but can be memorized and can be passed on. Well, here's the idea. Ideas are in many ways not subject to the sword So then we try and kill the idea bearers, whether that we burn books or we kill people or we, and in a sense, the whole free speech conversation now is a question of, can we use the sword to continue to destroy stories? And that's in a sense the tyranny of the tyrannical worldviews, that we are going to employ the inorganic in order to destroy the story-based. Well, other religions use similar tricks. Reincarnation is an attempt at duplicating a pattern beyond death. The difficulty with reincarnation is that whereas there's some people, they try to go back into past lives, in the Christian story, my memory, myself, my patterns goes into the grave, inorganic. Resurrection comes out of the grave. And I coming out of the grave is, in Christianity, the representation of me, my pattern. That is Paul Vanderklay with my personality and all of this. Now in Christian theology, perfected somehow. Roman Catholics will tend to go to purgatory, and I very much understand how that theological tradition developed. The Reformers kind of kvetched on it because they didn't find it in Scripture, and that was the particular canon they were trying to use to purify the tradition before them. But this pattern, that is Paul Vanderklay, with personality, with memory, with all that I have, then gets translated in Christianity in a way. Part of the difficulty with reincarnation is you have to ask that, what exactly is reincarnated? Not your personality, not your story. Paul Vanderklay in Christianity with resurrection, son of Stan and Barb, heir of this tradition of Dutch Calvinism, heir of Northside Chapel Christian Reformed Church in Paterson, New Jersey, and all the unique people there, heir of the ministry that I did in the Dominican Republic, heir of Living Stones and all of the interactions of the personalities and image bearers at Living Stones, heir of Classis Central California, now heir of the conversations that I'm having over Jordan Peterson at my Jordan Peterson meetups and via email and comment section and conversations online. Heir of all of this gets resurrected, and the inorganic doesn't finally win over the pattern that is Paul Vanderklay. This incredibly complex pattern. And then, of course, not just Paul Vanderklay, but in Christianity, again and again and again, and not just me as an individual, but the community, which is the church, the saints. That's how it's represented, and on and on and on this goes. Now, reincarnation says, well, something gets recycled, and there's a whole theology around that. But I think Christianity, the reason I'm a Christian is I think Christianity offers a better representation. Karma is an attempt to have morality transcend death, and in some ways, ideas of morality do transcend death. Goodness and badness isn't necessarily killed by death, but it's threatened by death because the moral hosts are threatened by death. But is morality, the pattern itself, again, Pageau is saying, the pattern is primary and it gets exhibited throughout the system. And you're not really going to answer that question based on science, because what comes first? Is it the pattern, or is it the expression of the pattern in the real world? Now we've got Plato and Aristotle we're dealing with them. Karma is an attempt to have morality transcend death, but karma is mechanistic, and that mechanism is a reflection of the impersonal in some of those worldviews. Well, in Christianity, it isn't really karma. There is a judge. And why is that judge represented in terms of a person? Because whereas, let's say in law, well, do this, you receive this penalty. Well, a judge comes and says, well, but the reality is more complex than just do this, receive this penalty. Kill someone, receive the death penalty. Oh, but you killed in self-defense. Well, that changes the outcome. And that's why the personal, the judge, the conscious bearing being that can see all the factors. And again, in Christianity, the representation is that God is the conscious bearing but the conscious bearing being that sees all and can correctly discern all. Now, you might be skeptical and say, no such thing will ever happen. Okay, and I'd say, well, how do you know? You can't know that. I certainly hope it's true. And in fact, I would argue that every representation on earth of justice points and tries to derive itself from that ultimate representation of justice, which is why traditionally, before we got a little simplistic about symbology, well, you put, say, the 2 tablets of the law in a courthouse. You put the 10 commandments on a courthouse. It isn't, now people can interpret that as worldview tyranny, but it can also be interpreted sacramentally, that what should happen in the courtroom is in fact as true as possible a pattern, a representation of the fundamental pattern of justice, of the judge being able to look at all of the pertinent information and declare a remedy or a sentence that maintains the universe. That is what justice is for. Now, Christianity offers different answers, obviously, from reincarnation and karma. The renovation of the materiality itself, that is the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus is the first fruits of the renovation of all materiality, and he embodies that in himself. He is the spirit. The logos finally governs stuff, and C.S. Lewis does an amazing job of talking about that in his book Miracles. Also see the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, the spiritual body. Now often in the grips of materiality, people look at that and say, well, it isn't a physical body. That's not the sense in which Paul is using the word spiritual. When Paul talks about life in the spirit, Paul is talking about spirit, our patterns being governed by the pattern. Us being in line with the foundational pattern. Okay. Now part of my kvetch about the pattern talk is that pattern lends itself again more to impersonality. And I know Jonathan Pageau wouldn't go there because of, again, he goes back to consciousness and says consciousness, our small consciousness, is derivative of the large, the all consciousness that God is, because our small consciousness needs hierarchies to apprehend the world, but God can apprehend all fully, completely, through and through, without limitation. And again, you might say, well, how do we know that such a being exists? Well, read David Bentley Hart on God. That language is in a sense already biasing us in one way rather than the other, and I would kind of use an ontological argument to say, well, if it doesn't exist, then neither do we, in a sense, because this gets into the debate with materialism. Is material derivative and spirit, such a slippery word, spirit, but it's the most traditional word. Is spirit foundational or is material foundational? And so Pageau and Peterson are saying pattern is foundational, and materiality is governed by pattern. That's what I've been saying throughout this whole video. And as C.S. Lewis says, true myth made flesh. In the beginning was logos, the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Here you see John setting out the basis for a Trinity. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. Your pattern or your soul more faithfully transcends death than mere offspring. The Logos conquers death. DNA is a trick and a hack to compete with death, but it can't conquer death. Logos conquers death. There's a spirit under the world. There's a spirit under reality. It's a pattern. Oops, I lost my slide. And that's where you get logos and flesh. Now, this wound up being a little longer than I thought it would, but I wanted to get this out. And let me know what you think of it. It's big thanks to everyone who showed up at the Jordan Peterson meetup last night in Sacramento. Kyle, I thought, brought some really good stuff from San Luis Obispo. So great having you. Kyle and Kevin both came up, and they shared 9:30 Sunday school, and I haven't posted that yet. Forgot to hit record on the sermon, so you'll have to go to the Facebook page if you want to watch this week's sermon. I did the rough draft to the sermon on this channel already, but big thanks to the Jordan Peterson meetup group, because they continue to challenge both the materialists and those who are increasingly interested and impacted by, Chris was there, and Chris has been coming to our Sunday school class at Living Stones, and he was there, and he's working through, he's working through Jordan Peterson's book list. He's reading Jung, and also David came up from the Bay Area. So a bunch of people came in, and then all the regulars, Joey and Tyler and Rick and Mike, and James wasn't here this week, but the whole cast of characters in the meetups. And for me, what an invaluable, rich community of thinking through and trying to discern truth and testing ideas and debating. And I love those meetup meetings. They're just, highlights of the week. So, and I hope this video was helpful.